to introduce first Grace Burzese, our celebrated artist. Who has been kind enough to join us in this conversation today, and Natalie McDonagh. Natalie has not only written the essay for the catalogue, which is an e-catalogue online. We've printed a few small copies, very few copies, mainly as sort of mementos for the artist and the gallery archive. But Natalie also designed the actual catalogue itself, apart from writing the essay. But she also designed the text and the introduction to the exhibition itself. And then, of course, I'm Max Dingle, the curator, and you can blame me for the way it's hung. So you can have a seat if you like. I thought I'd like to start by explaining a little bit about how I first met Grace. On the wall just over on the other side there's a red painting called Markings. That painting I first seen, it's on that far wall over there, you can look at it afterwards. That painting I first seen when I walked into the Art Gallery of New South Wales for the Silver Prize exhibition. And I was suddenly struck by this painting and I just couldn't leave it. It sort of blew my mind really, because it was, I kept thinking of Oriental carpets. It's just like a carpet, like a magic carpet. It sort of took my mind away to exotic places, and I just absolutely adored it. And I went back and seen it a couple of times. And then I thought, well, what the hell? And I contacted the art gallery and said, look, I really need to know who is representing this artist, because I want to talk to the gallery about acquiring that work. There was then dead silence for 8 weeks. And then out of the blue, I got a phone call. Hello, I'm Grace. I'm not represented by anyone. And I was invited to the studio, and that sort of started a friendship. Yeah. And then on that visit, I then also acquired Temple, which is this other painting just here. And they were the first 2 works of about, I think, 6 I have now. All of those 6 works, in fact, are now bequested and part of the collection here at the Shoalhaven Regional Gallery. And then since then, Jim Burkett, if you know, some people know Jim Burkett, who worked at Bundanon and died recently, well, he also gifted to the gallery 2 of Grace's works, because Jim had a gallery in Sydney in the 90s and exhibited Grace in her first solo exhibition. Yeah. And so the Shoalhaven has really quite good connections to this artist and her work, and it'll be sort of ongoing because, you know, we now have at least 8 works in the collection here. So that was my reason for putting on this survey show of Grace's work, to introduce you and to the way Grace operates and changes in terms of slight changes in style and the way she approaches painting over a period of time. And while you can look at an early work like Temple and think, yes, well, I like that or I don't like it or whatever, and that's how that artist works. You have to remember artists paint for themselves, paint to try and I suppose, feel as if they want to achieve something, to solve a problem, but I'll leave some of that for Grace to talk about how she approaches her work. But you also have to realise that they change. An artist changes over time. They're not satisfied with looking at one particular challenge. They change their approach to art. And I would have liked to have done a full retrospective, not a retrospective, but a full 30-year look at the way Grace works. And to do that, we would have had to taken over the entire gallery, all 4 galleries. But because of COVID and the difficulty of borrowing works from people and getting them all together, we had to be satisfied with doing a survey. And this survey looks at different points along the path, along a 30-year, or almost 30-year path of this particular artist. And that's why it's called Points on a Path. So that'll be enough as an introduction from me, and I'll ask Natalie, who first met Grace fairly recently when I managed to get her involved in this, and you might like to talk a little bit about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. Can you hear me if I don't have the microphone?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Thank you. So Max was talking about how artists change. I'd like to pick up on that, and I would like to talk about a couple of things in the way that I think are absolutely consistent to me, anyway, in Grace's art from the earliest pieces that we have from the mid-90s here. And like Max, I'd like to start with a story. So I was fortunate enough to meet Grace through Max at the beginning of last year. We came here to look at the space, and then Max very generously took us to a posh lunch, and all gorgeous, lovely weather, listening to Grace talk about her work, and so you know, completely in a happy place, sitting there with Max and this gorgeous artist, and you know, lovely food, and then I hear Grace say, first you make one mark, then you make another, and suddenly you're in love. Anyway, I didn't choke on my food, but I do remember my body's response was, oh. And that really drew my attention to something, and I scribbled it down in my notebook, which I had handy, and that has stayed with me throughout. This idea of love, that how one can be in love with one's art practice, but what I've come to realise and enjoy is actually the thread of love that runs through Grace's work is love for life as well as her art making. And I would, you know, probably love's not the first thing that might come to mind when you come to an exhibition, and an exhibition like this, but I encourage you to really think about that as you look at the works. I think you'd be very hard pushed to find an artist whose work embodies and celebrates life and love in the way that Grace's work does. So, anyway, that's the theme that I picked up in the essay, and so I'm not going to say any more about that, other than encourage you to, you know, do as Max says, when you're looking at the work, you might need a little bit of time for your system to adjust to looking at the works, which I think we might possibly find overwhelming at first, which was my reaction on occasion, but I have to say I've really come to appreciate the exuberance present here. which I'm certainly finding rarer and rarer in the times we're living in. So, and the other thing about the thing that I would say hasn't changed at all just occurred to me this morning as Max and I were talking. We were in the foyer looking at the big work on this wall in the foyer, Southern, and the small work on paper, Tombstone in Shadow too. And visually they're very different. One's a huge painting and one's a small work on paper. And I was saying to Max, these two works hang together surprisingly well in a way that I might not have thought would, because visually they're so different. So then that led me to think about, well, why is that? And actually, what came to me was that because both, despite the fact their visual expressions are very different, in both, they both capture Grace's embodied experience. And so it's not about surface decoration. So where with other artists you might find yourself, or Max might find himself, hanging things because of their visual connection, Grace's work goes beyond that much more deeply. So whether they're quiet and muted or whether they're totally electrifying works, still that capture of her embodied experience is present. So I would encourage you to just give yourself over to the art, linger a bit, don't rush for the drinks, and let these glorious, glorious works speak to you. So, thank you.
My turn. Firstly, thank you all for coming here today. It's a real honour to have work up in this gallery. Thank you both for all you've done, and it's a real joy to share it with you. I don't know too much of what I can add. It's really lovely hearing other people actually interpret your work or discuss your work, and I must say I've learnt something about myself as well through both of you and your reflections about my art making. So they are about embodied space, and they very much are about responding to a mark as I make it, or a colour, and then just building a work and puzzling it out. But I suppose there is an exuberance there that I hadn't sort of thought about for myself, and that is really beautiful to try and embody and to take on. So thank you for that as well. That's the joy of sharing the work, because we do make it for ourselves. But ultimately we do want it to leave us, and we want to create an experience for other people. I don't know if I can add to that. I mean, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, yeah.
Maybe you could, I've got a question.
Okay.
Speak about the development of the work from these that are very strong marks, and then over the years you've come to more smaller marks but layered works, and the palette is sort of developing. Maybe you could tell us more about
a long time. There's a long time frame between these works, and I think for years I was very much stuck on just almost that primal act of making a mark. It's almost like drawing, but drawing in paint and adding some colour. And so line really interested me, and the different effects line can have and how that creates space within a work. And then I think over time it's just, you explore that to a certain degree, and then you tire of it, and you need to just create new challenges for yourself or new things to explore. And for me it will usually come down to a new material. So you can see there's the aluminium that I've tried painting on, because that was really interesting in how light changes on aluminium, so the works change themselves as well. And then, or sometimes it can be a colour. And so these later works, you're right, it was about bringing some shape and a different form of movement within the works. But I think essentially I'm always interested in creating a space. So I kind of always I enter that work in a way. It's sort of like the canvas opens up, and so I try and layer things so that you can see in between those marks, and they create different layers. And this one was just almost like being in a really well lit kind of space, or light. It's called light particles, but just or it could have also been birthday party, and you can kind of see why. It's just there's those moments when you're in spaces and it's the movement of light and bodies moving around you and things like that. Trying to capture a semblance of what that feels like, or that overwhelming celebration of colour or flickers of light and things like that. And obviously I reduce it in a very abstract way.
Hey Grace, were these executed quickly? Like it has a sense of, did you put it to the side and...
These, pretty much all the works are never executed as quickly as you think they are. I will lay something down and I will respond to it, and then sometimes some things can come relatively quickly. Actually, I think Touched came together quite quickly. Some sort of sing and then they're done, and others I might be working a few at a time, and so I layer them in that way. And I would definitely leave them aside, and sometimes I can't. It's easy to overwork something or to get neurotic around it and to overlay things. So sometimes, and I was laughing, she's seen me in the studio. So sometimes it's definitely about putting it aside and not looking at it for a month or so and pulling it back out, and am I convinced by it? Like, does this still work or does it not? And so,
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that I discovered in terms of putting this exhibition together was in the notes about we needed for the catalogue and picked up by Natalie, was the fact that Grace really, when she started off, wanted to be in the arts, and while writing seemed like a good idea, she really wanted to be a dancer. and I think you can see that.
I never did any of it though. It was just, it was
Well, you
just
did.
burning the detachment.
Well,
Like,
the paintings like choreography.
Yeah. So you can see it in the choreography of the art, and in the fact that each brushstroke is a full body thing. It's not just a little dab of paint. There's this full body. If you look at those brushstrokes, you think, you know, it must be someone this big who's putting that paint across it. But it's sort of it's showing the body as the body is present there in the actual work and the body movement. And so it's a fabulous thing to sort of get that insight into how an artist works and how they physically use their body to make art. The other thing that I find and have always found totally and utterly courageous about Grace and her work is the willingness to experiment with materials. And if you look at markings over there, it is a mixture of acrylic paint and iron oxide. And it's sort of a bit flaky. The iron oxide falls off a bit and it's sort of aged and changed. But then again, if you look at Temple, that's using beeswax and acrylic. And again, the painting's on aluminium. It's sort of experimenting with the use of materials and working out, how can I do this? How can I create a particular effect? And the small paintings just behind over there, the almost experiments in colour and how colour works together, and I think they were made over a period of X number of years.
Yeah. So it's sort of like a body of work, not that each individual one took years to create, but yeah, I keep coming in and out of those smaller works, and they all responding to them.
And so they're brilliant small works. And you also, once the aluminium, I'm not quite sure whether in the aluminium, did the painting on aluminium come first, or then did you get mad at it and crush it up? And if you see, there's a small sculpture around there. We could have got more sculptures, but I did love that small sculpture called Reflected Blue, which is a sort of manipulated, painted aluminium, but manipulated into a small sculpture. And now, did you just get mad at it one day? And
No.
I wanted to experiment with that.
Yeah, I do love like painting as objects, so sort of extending the painting practice.
Yeah.
And I had been painting, I think the aluminium, painting on aluminium came first, and then I thought this would be wonderful to to morph it into something else, and so then I found some more malleable aluminium to be able to do that.
Yeah, because they are really lovely works, and at one point I did acquire one for the collection, although it's not here. I've still got it at home, and I'll surrender it to the gallery at some point in time. I've already surrendered a few, and we're gradually taking the entire collection into the gallery, so with Bridget's help. The other work that we have acquired for the collection is that at one point, you might explain this other experiment of, there were a series of small works which were then translated into silk scarves. And
Yes.
can you...
They're that scale that you see of those small ones there, actually, and I think, look, when you create a person, I think you just want to keep experimenting and creating in some form or another, and so I just thought it could be really interesting to move into wearables and things like that. So I printed 3 patterns of paintings onto scarves, and
and they're quite beautiful. Natalie,
I would just like to alert you to, I had the great pleasure of being able to interview and talk to Grace at length. So in the catalogue, which is online, and as Max says, we have a few print ones as well, which are available to you. I was able to include a lot of quotes from Grace relating to the works, and so the catalogue is laid out with Grace's words and the works interwoven together. So for those of you who are interested in getting a little bit deeper into how the whole thing manifests, then that's in the catalogue.
thank you.